On the wide savannas of West Africa, the Oyo Empire rose like a storm. Its cavalry thundered across the land, its kings sat on thrones draped in power, and its markets overflowed with wealth. To outsiders, Oyo looked unshakable, a kingdom blessed by the ancestors, a force that could not be broken. But greatness often comes with a hidden price. Along the slave coast, where European ships waited with their cannons and cargo holds, a bargain was struck. The kings of Oyo, eager to secure their dominance, traded their neighbors, their prisoners, and eventually their own subjects for muskets, cloth, and gold. What began as strategy soon became dependence, and what was once honor turned into hypocrisy. Satire writes itself in these contradictions. Kings proclaimed divine duty while their palaces echoed with the cries of captives. Rulers celebrated victories while caravans of chained men, women, and children were marched to the coast. They called it necessity. They called it progress. History calls it betrayal. This is the forgotten story of Oyo, a kingdom that gambled its soul on power only to find its throne built on sand. Tonight, we uncover how Oyo's pursuit of glory led to its tragic fall, how betrayal hollowed its foundations, and how the echoes of resistance still carry a voice of justice. The Oyo Empire rose from the savannah like a lion claiming its territory. Its capital, Oyo-Ile, became the beating heart of Yoruba civilization, a city of courtyards, palaces, shrines, and markets where dust and power mingled in the air. At the throne sat the Alaafin of Oyo, King of Kings, believed to embody both human rule and divine sanction. His authority radiated from the palace outward like ripples in water. Nobles bowed, generals saluted, and priests chanted oaths that tied his reign to the ancestors. Oyo's strength lay in its cavalry. Horses, rare and precious in West Africa, gave the empire a fearsome edge. Warriors mounted on swift steeds thundered across the savannas, their speed unmatched, their presence terrifying. Battles were won not just by numbers, but by momentum. The empire was more than its armies. At its core was a careful balance of power. The Oyo Mezi, a council of high nobles, had the right to check the Alaafin, even to demand his ritual suicide if he betrayed his duty. Justice, at least in principle, was woven into the throne. Spiritual order anchored this balance. Priests of Shango, god of thunder, invoked storms to bless armies and punish liars. Diviners cast cowrie shells to reveal truth. Oaths sworn by the ancestors bound rulers and subjects alike. To defy justice was to invite lightning itself. Trade carried Oyo's influence far beyond its borders. Caravans brought salt from the Sahara, cola nuts from the forests, ivory from hunters, and textiles from skilled weavers. Markets roared with voices, a chorus of commerce that linked Oyo to neighbors and distant roots alike. Expansion came with momentum. Provinces fell under Oyo's sway, paying tribute in goods, soldiers, and allegiance. Neighboring kingdoms bent to its will, and the empire's maps stretched wider each decade. With each victory, the Alaafin's glory grew brighter, his court richer. Satire crept in quietly. Kings proclaimed themselves guardians of justice, yet celebrated most loudly when tribute piled high. Nobles spoke of honor, but sharpened their weapons with greedy smiles. Oyo's rituals cloaked ambition, its prayers cloaked hunger. By the 16th century, Oyo stood tall among Africa's great powers. Its throne gleamed, its cavalry dominated, and its markets flourished. To its own people, it was strength incarnate. To rivals, it was a storm to be feared. To Europeans just arriving on the coast, it was an opportunity ripe for exploitation. The Atlantic winds brought sails to West Africa's shores. By the early 16th century, Portuguese ships anchored off the coast, their flags snapping, their decks heavy with muskets, liquor, cloth, and trinkets polished bright to dazzle the eye. They came not as conquerors at first, but as merchants of promises. For the Oyo Empire, the coast was both frontier and lifeline. Salt, ivory, and cola nuts flowed inland, while new goods arrived from across the seas. To kings and nobles, these strangers offered more than goods. They offered leverage. Muskets could tip the balance of war. Liquor could bind treaties. Gold could crown ambitions. The coast soon earned a new name, the Slave Coast. At first, captives from wars and raids were bartered away, seen as spoils of battle. But the demand from Europe grew insatiable. Ships no longer asked politely for ivory or pepper. They demanded people, living bodies measured by age, weight, and strength. Satirical irony bloomed. Europeans spoke of civilization while inspecting captives like cattle. Traders offered crosses and prayers while weighing chains in their hands. They called it commerce. It was betrayal wrapped in polite smiles. The Alafin and his chiefs faced temptation sharp as a blade. Selling captives meant wealth, meant muskets, meant dominance over rivals. What had been a side effect of war became its purpose. Raids were no longer fought to defend, but to capture. Justice bent beneath the weight of muskets and gold. Caravans stretched from the savannah to the coast, long lines of chained men, women, and children. Dust clung to their bodies as they shuffled under the watch of soldiers. Behind them, nobles congratulated themselves on alliances, while merchants scribbled profits into ledgers. The more Oyo engaged, the more dependent it became. Muskets fueled expansion, but they also chained the empire to the trade. Without captives to sell, there would be no guns. Without guns, there would be no power. The bargain tightened like a noose. And so, the slave coast thrived, but it thrived on ruin. The riches that flowed into Oyo's palaces were bought with tears. The power of its cavalry was paid for in betrayal. The coast glittered with trade, but its sands were wet with sorrow. The Alafin's throne was meant to guard the people, but on the slave coast, that throne became a bargaining table. Rulers of Oyo struck deals with European traders, cloaking betrayal in the language of necessity. They called it diplomacy. History calls it chains. At first, the justification was simple. Captives were spoils of war. Enemies defeated on the battlefield could be sold instead of executed. Kings told themselves it was mercy, a twisted mercy that filled treasuries while emptying villages. But soon, the line blurred. It was not only enemies who were sold, but neighbors caught in raids, subjects accused of petty crimes, even kin betrayed for muskets. Power spoke louder than blood. The bargain spread like fire, devouring conscience. Satirical irony sharpened the scene. A king proclaimed himself chosen by the gods to protect his people, then handed them to Portuguese traders with the other hand. Chiefs swore oaths of justice before ancestors, then sold captives at markets built beside shrines. The gods were invoked in the morning, betrayed by nightfall. European traders played their roles with rehearsed smiles. They praised Oyo's rulers as wise and civilized, then measured captives by height and muscle. They toasted to friendship, then signed contracts written in iron shackles. They carried crucifixes in one pocket and chains in the other. For Oyo's rulers, the bargain was intoxicating. Muskets gave their cavalry an edge no rival could match. Cloth dyed in colors unseen in Yoruba looms dazzled the court. Barrels of liquor flowed at festivals. Tribute rolled in. The empire swelled, believing itself stronger with every deal. But strength bought with betrayal is weakness in disguise. The empire grew addicted to the trade. Muskets were no longer a luxury. They were a necessity. Each campaign required more captives. Each captive required more raids, and each raid fed the same cycle of betrayal. Villages learned to fear their own armies. Caravans of captives marched past markets where once farmers sold cassava and palm oil. The land that once traded in goods of honor now dealt in lives. The slave coast became less a frontier of opportunity and more a theater of hypocrisy. And so, the bargain of kings hollowed Oyo's greatness. Gold glittered in the palaces, muskets gleamed in the armories, but trust bled into the earth. The throne still shone, but it stood upon the backs of those chained and carried to the coast. Once the bargain was struck, Oyo turned betrayal into a system. What had begun as occasional exchanges became the very engine of its politics and economy. Captives were no longer incidental. They became the empire's most valuable export. Raiding evolved into routine. Cavalry thundered into villages not only to defend borders but to harvest bodies. The empire's strength, once measured in loyal subjects, was now counted in chained lines of men, women, and children. Soldiers brought captives to markets as though they were trophies of honor. Satirical irony spilled across the scene. Chiefs claimed to uphold law, then used petty accusations to justify selling innocents. Neighbors denounced one another, not for justice, but for profit. Oaths once sworn to ancestors as sacred became loopholes for betrayal, twisted to fit the hunger of the trade. Markets along the slave coast grew grotesquely efficient. Stalls once filled with textiles and cola nuts now echoed with the cries of captives. Portuguese, Dutch, and later British traders built forts beside these markets, stone walls standing as monuments to greed. Ships lined the horizon like vultures waiting for carcasses. The inspection process revealed the cruelty behind the mask of commerce. Traders pried open mouths to check teeth, prodded muscles as if valuing cattle, searched bodies for scars that hinted at rebellion. Each human being was reduced to a number in a ledger, a price on a scale, a unit of labor. Satire sharpened further. Missionaries spoke of saving souls, even as they blessed forts that stored captives in dungeons. Merchants toasted to civilization while calculating survival rates per ship. Kings invoked the gods of thunder for strength, yet their offerings to the gods were their own people, sold to strangers. The machinery was not only external, it reshaped Oyo's politics. Power was now defined by the ability to supply captives. Rival chiefs measured their influence not in wisdom or loyalty, but in the number of people they delivered to the coast. Betrayal became the language of authority. Caravans stretched endlessly across the savannah. Dust rose from the feet of chained columns, guarded by soldiers whose muskets gleamed with foreign iron. Families were torn apart in silence, the land littered with abandoned fields and broken villages. Each step toward the coast was a step away from Oyo's soul. The forts became warehouses of suffering. Captives languished in dark rooms with little air, packed so tightly they could hardly move. The air reeked of fear and sweat. Outside, kings and traders exchanged handshakes and prayers, congratulating themselves on diplomacy while despair festered beneath stone walls. This machinery of betrayal fed itself. Each musket bought required another raid. Each raid filled another ship. Each ship encouraged more demand. Oyo, once feared for its cavalry and admired for its order, became a kingdom enslaved by its own commerce. And so, the empire that once claimed to defend justice now stood as the architect of chains. Its power was undeniable, its wealth impressive, but every coin that filled its coffers was stained with betrayal. The machinery turned endlessly, grinding dignity into dust. At its height, the Oyo Empire appeared invincible. Cavalry swept across the savannas, muskets cracked in the air, and tribute poured into Oyo Ile. To outsiders, it was the image of unstoppable might, a kingdom that dominated the slave coast and cowed its rivals into silence. The Alafin sat in splendor, surrounded by courtiers who praised his wisdom and generals who boasted of endless victories. Palaces filled with European cloth, liquor, and gold gleamed under torchlight. Festivals thundered with drums, dancers leaping in celebration of Oyo's greatness. But satire lingers in the cracks. Beneath the glitter of power lay dependence. Muskets had become the empire's lifeblood, but muskets could only be bought with captives. The stronger Oyo seemed, the more it was chained to the very trade that hollowed its strength. Villages looked upon the cavalry not as protectors, but as predators. Families whispered in fear, never knowing if tomorrow's dawn would bring soldiers demanding captives. The empire boasted of divine authority, yet its people prayed to the ancestors for deliverance from their own rulers. European traders fanned the illusion. They praised Oyo's kings as partners, toasted them as wise allies, showered them with gifts. Behind their smiles, they recorded profits in ledgers and calculated how long before Oyo too would collapse under the weight of its own bargain. The empire's image abroad was polished like gold, but inside it, cracked like brittle clay. For power purchased with betrayal cannot last. The more Oyo flaunted its greatness, the closer it drew to ruin. Every empire wears its strength like armor until the first cracks appear. For Oyo, the glitter of muskets and gold hid a foundation already weakening. The very system that fueled its rise began to poison its core. Subject states grew restless, provinces tired of paying tribute in captives and goods. Vassal kings, once loyal, began to rebel against Oyo's endless demands. The empire's cavalry thundered to suppress them, but each campaign drained more loyalty than it restored. Satire sharpened in whispers. The Alafin declared himself chosen to uphold justice, yet his own subjects muttered that he fed them to strangers. Nobles toasted victories at banquets, while villagers slipped away at night, fleeing to forests rather than risk betrayal by their own chiefs. European traders exploited the cracks. They armed Oyo's enemies as readily as they armed Oyo itself. For them, war was profit, and the more fractured Oyo became, the more captives poured to the coast. The empire that thought itself master of the trade was, in truth, its servant. The machinery of betrayal hollowed trust. Families suspected neighbors, chiefs distrusted nobles, and nobles plotted against the Alafin. A throne that once stood on ancestral oaths now trembled under greed. The empire appeared strong, but within, loyalty had rotted. By the 18th century, cracks split wider. Slave raids no longer just targeted rivals, they turned inward, breaking the very communities Oyo relied upon. Armies returned with chains, but fewer allies. What use is power when your own people pray for your downfall? The throne still glittered, the cavalry still thundered, the fort still hummed with commerce. But beneath it all, betrayal whispered louder than drums. The cracks in the throne were no longer hidden, they were the prophecy of collapse. By the dawn of the 19th century, the illusion of Oyo's invincibility had shattered. The empire, once feared across the savannah, now staggered under the weight of its own bargain. The slave coast, which had fed its power, became the road to its undoing. Subject states rose in rebellion. Dahomey, long humiliated under Oyo's dominance, struck back with ferocity. The empire's cavalry, once feared, struggled to maintain control. Muskets that once gave Oyo the edge were now in the hands of its rivals, courtesy of the same traders who had armed Oyo years before. Satire dripped from every scene. Kings who had traded their people for guns now found those same guns pointed at their thrones. Nobles who had celebrated their wealth now watched villages burn. The empire that sold others into chains now saw its own foundations shackled by betrayal. Internal strife worsened the ruin. The Alafin Ole, remembered as the king whose reign unraveled Oyo, faced rebellion within and defeat without. In despair, he is said to have cursed the land before his death, declaring that no king after him would rule in peace. His words, bitter as iron, proved prophetic. The empire's economy crumbled. With fields abandoned and trust destroyed, Oyo depended almost entirely on the slave trade. But as Britain and others began moving toward abolition, demand weakened. The system Oyo relied upon dried up, leaving emptiness where wealth had once flowed. By the mid-19th century, Oyo was no longer an empire, but a memory. Its capital lay weakened, its provinces fragmented, its throne little more than a relic. The bargain that once promised power had delivered ruin. Betrayal, dressed as strategy, had devoured the kingdom whole. Even in the darkest hours, not all voices in Oyo bowed to greed. History, though often written by kings and traders, preserves whispers of those who resisted, who chose justice over profit, dignity over betrayal. Some chiefs refused to hand over their subjects, choosing exile rather than complicit rule. They fled inland with their people, vanishing into forests and marshes where Oyo's cavalry could not reach. Their defiance rarely entered royal chronicles, but lived on in oral traditions, remembered as sparks of honor. Spiritual leaders also rose against betrayal. Prophets condemned the trade as an abomination before the gods and ancestors. They warned that the thunder of Shango would strike kings who sold their kin, that ancestral curses would hollow the land. Satire wrote itself. While rulers prayed for divine favor, priests declared divine wrath. Villagers resisted in quieter ways. Families disguised their children, hid them in forests, or smuggled them into safer lands. Raiding parties sometimes returned empty-handed, thwarted not by armies, but by communities who chose flight over chains. Dignity survived in every act of refusal. There were uprisings too. Captives awaiting shipment sometimes revolted, storming slave markets or breaking free from caravans. Though most were brutally suppressed, their defiance testified that human spirit cannot be measured in ledgers. Even in chains, resistance carried the torch of justice. Satirical irony shone here as well. Kings preached about protecting the empire, while ordinary villagers became its true defenders by refusing betrayal. chiefs sought divine sanction for their greed, while prophets carried the real voice of the ancestors. The empire crumbled, but conscience endured. In these voices, history preserves a truth. Betrayal may dominate the chronicles, but resistance preserves dignity. Oyo was not only a kingdom of chains, but also a land where justice fought to survive, even when surrounded by greed. The collapse of Oyo did not end with its kings or palaces. Its legacy stretched far beyond the savannas, carried in chains across the Atlantic and carved into the memory of generations. The bargain of muskets and captives left wounds deeper than any battlefield. Villages emptied by raids never fully recovered. Lineages were broken, elders silenced, traditions interrupted. Families in the Americas traced fragments of songs, words, and rituals back to Yoruba lands, echoes of a home betrayed by its own throne. Satire lingers in the ruins. Kings who sought immortality through conquest are remembered not for their glory, but for their betrayal. Palaces have crumbled, names forgotten, but the shame of trading kin for power endures. What glittered for a season in Oyo's courts became chains that lasted centuries. The empire's dependence on the slave trade left it vulnerable to the tides of history. When European powers shifted toward abolition in the 19th century, Oyo's economy collapsed. The very bargain that made it powerful ensured its downfall. Its greatness was revealed as hollow, built on the suffering of its own people. Yet the legacy is not only ruin. The resistance of prophets, chiefs, and villagers preserved a moral line. Oral traditions in Yoruba culture still tell of those who refused betrayal, who warned of curses, who chose exile over complicity. In their defiance, dignity outlived the empire. The story of Oyo's fall is not merely African history, it is human history. It reminds us how greed, cloaked in necessity, can corrode trust and destroy kingdoms, but it also shows that even in betrayal's shadow, conscience can survive, carrying truth forward. The fall of the Oyo Empire is more than a story of kings and thrones. It is a mirror. It shows how power without justice crumbles, how wealth without conscience rots, and how betrayal dressed as necessity poisons the very soul of a nation. Oyo's kings proclaimed divine duty, yet sold their subjects for muskets. Nobles toasted victory, yet their victories hollowed the land. European traders preached civilization, yet filled their ships with chains. Satire needs no invention. Hypocrisy condemned itself. But history also remembers those who resisted. Chiefs who fled rather than betray. Prophets who warned of curses. Villagers who hid their children and carried justice in silence. Their names may be forgotten, but their defiance lives on as proof that conscience never fully vanished. Across the Atlantic, Yoruba traditions endured in song, ritual, and memory. Even in exile, the betrayed carried fragments of dignity. Their survival is an act of resistance, a testament that betrayal may wound, but truth outlasts empires. Today, Oyo's ruins whisper warnings. Kingdoms built on chains may glitter, but they collapse into dust. Power bought with betrayal is never secure. Faith without truth is hollow. Justice ignored becomes history's sharpest blade. Forgotten history is not forgotten justice. By remembering Oyo's tragic gamble, we honor those betrayed. We expose the hypocrisy of power, and we remind ourselves that history is not only what happened, it is a choice of which side we will stand on when faith becomes chains and when betrayal tempts power.